And thank you, Eleanor, and over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I'll just start sharing my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all see that fine. So yes, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you today about some emerging research in human origins. I think is really exciting because, you know, typically we haven't really spoken about rainforests when we think about the deep human past. These are areas that have traditionally been really peripheral to the human story, which has tended to focus on grassland and savanna areas in Eastern Africa and Southern Africa, but really far from the rainforest belt. And this is Africa's tropical forest belt over here. And you can see it's pretty far from the sort of iconic areas of human evolution over here in the African Rift and further south in Southern Africa. And I'm sure, you know, we've all seen these beautiful dioramas of hominins walking against a sort of Serengeti backdrop, where, you know, this idea that this is the ecological context of human evolution is really, really strong. And as a result of that, we haven't really had a very long conversation about other regions of Africa. They were just simply not considered important, and all the sort of research effort went into these sort of eastern, southern grassland and savanna areas. But when we talk about rainforests, a lot of people seem to picture something that looks like this. This is actually gallery forest along the Senegal River, so it's not even in the actual rainforest proper. And apart from these sort of strong ideas about what people have about rainforest, I think there's also a lot of preconceptions about these ecological zones, which really have until now lain at the periphery of the areas that are considered to have been important for human evolution. So, for example, there are a lot of tropes about rainforests, these jungles, this idea of these homogeneous green hells that are entirely unsuited for human habitation. And I think there's this sort of idea of this sort of jungle that has been popularized in these sort of Tarzan movies is you know, very much with us. We see it in these sort of I'm a celebrity, get me out of here. You see, you know, these people in these awful conditions that really reinforce the stereotype that you know, rainforest areas are these sort of very homogeneous areas that are unsuitable for human habitation. And I think these ideas have really filtered into anthropology as well. So they're really three interrelated perspectives in anthropology that have played a significant role in keeping rainforests out of the discussion. So there's this idea that people cannot live in rainforests without agriculture. And so modern rainforest foragers, such as those living in the Ituri rainforest in Central Africa, had to trade with agriculturalists in return for labor to be able to live there. So this was like a really dominant idea for a long time. And this really fed into this idea that rainforests are barriers, they're inhospitable environments, they have this cryptic fauna, there's this sort of sparse distribution of carbohydrates and fats. It just can only support these, if anybody, it supports very low numbers of hunter-gatherers. And this has also led to this sort of simple dichotomy of forest versus not forest. So this idea of forest as completely homogeneous barrier entities. You're either in the forest or you're out in the open environment of the savannas. And there really, you know, is a very strong dichotomy. So why are we looking at rainforests now if this is the case? And I think I have to sort of backtrack a little bit and just give you some research context into why suddenly we are thinking about these regions of Africa. And this is simply because for a long time, what you see here in this picture was the dominant model of human evolution. So what I term now as a simple out of Africa model. And this is this idea that humans like us, so Homo sapiens, evolved from a single small population somewhere in Africa, typically cast as Eastern Africa. And from there, and generally this sort of open grassland environment, went on to disperse into the rest of the earth and adapt according to all the different environments they're in. But from about 2018, we started to argue that the data no longer supported this model. This model was good for a long time, but you know, in the past few years, there's been like a glut of new data from very different fields, that together, provide all this independent evidence that requires us to really update this model. So what we think now is that humans, well, most of Africa played a role in human evolution. So most, if not all, played some role in human evolution. We don't know enough about it to say which regions may have been more important than others, if that's even really a question. But it's this idea that we have to understand the whole of the African continent if we are to understand human origins in a more realistic framework. And I just want to briefly go over the reasons why we think this. So the fossil data is quite sparse, but we can still tell quite a lot from it. And mainly what we can tell from the fossil data is that it really doesn't give good support to this sort of single population hypothesis. So the first thing that we notice about the key fossil data is that there's a huge geographic spread of putative Homo sapiens fossils across Africa. And they're all really different from each other. So any of these individuals look more different from each other than any two individuals from any populations you could think of today. So people are really, really different from each other, and they were strongly subdivided. And what's really interesting about these fossils is they each exhibit different combinations of what we call primitive and derived features. So the combination of the constellation of features that defines us today isn't found in any single individual until sometime between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago in Africa. And the reason we have this gap is because we simply don't have enough fossils from that time frame to be able to refine it any further. But before this time, you have this different combination of modern and archaic features in different individuals. So you might find different modern features in some individuals compared to others, and you have these different combinations. And actually, this doesn't just stop 40,000 years ago like a switch. Actually, individuals with primitive features continue to exist right up to the Holocene. And so none of these people really look like anybody living today. And what this tells us is, there isn't sort of a point where we become biologically modern. Humans have these really deep African roots, and it's really this sort of complex process of mixing that resulted in who we are today at the current time slice. And if we look at the archaeology, we also see something pretty similar. We don't see sort of this explosion of change, a sort of fundamental shift in the way people make and use tools coming from one place in Africa. Instead, we see this sort of Pan-African shift towards what we call Middle Stone Age technology or core and flake technology. And if we sort of make the usual list of what tends to define like modern material culture, or the earliest prehistory of our species, things like plant processing or the use of pigments, personal ornamentation, we really don't see anything that's a smoking gun emerges from one region and spread. Instead, it seems to be this Pan-African process. And even if we look at the later examples of behavioral complexity, so this is things like the use of bone tools, personal ornamentation, the earliest examples of art and decoration, regional technological styles that might stand for different identities or different groups. We don't see this emerging in one area. So it's not like this, there was some cognitive shift happened at some point in human history in one place and at one time. Actually, we see these things emerging at opposite ends of the African continent, Northern Africa and Southern Africa, very comparable records. And of course, at those distances, it's really not possible to say that they're influencing each other. So we have, again, this Pan-African process. Genetics doesn't have the answers either at this point. And in fact, it's really important that we just put all the evidence together in one pot and just try to see how they compare with each other. But for a long time, human ancestry tends to be depicted in terms of trees. This is a very intuitive way to understand human ancestry. But actually, if you look at the evidence and you try and model what we see in a variation of different African populations, we don't see clean splits with isolation, which is basically the description of a tree. Instead, we see something that's a little messier. And I think this is quite a nice diagram to try to explain it. So here you have a typical tree where you have this sort of persistent core population or lineage from which other populations diverge. Whereas what we think we're looking at is something that's more on the right. This is a meta-population that emphasizes migration and connections represented by lines at the base of each column. with additional lines representing further migration. So populations come into being, they go extinct, they pass on genes to other populations, and no population really persists in unmixed form. Instead, you have a mix of a mix of a mix. And this, in this model, ancestry can be found across more than one population, and of course, more than one region throughout the evolution of Homo sapiens. And this is probably a result of the fractured habitats we see across Africa over the last 500,000 years. So we know that different regions of Africa became more habitable or less habitable at different points in time. And this would have acted as a sort of a pump, pushing and pulling different populations into different regions of Africa, of course, at times isolating them, and at other times bringing them into contact with one another. And we see something very similar happening with, for example, Pan-African mammal species. And I think this is a really important point to make, because when we look at the DNA of people living today in Africa, most of the variation is driven by expansions in the last few thousand years that relate to the spread of agriculture. And this has really overprinted some of the really deep signals of demography that we are interested in. But of course, animals preserve the history of the environments that hominins evolved in. And what we see for many different Pan-African mammal species is similar patterns of substructure that have something to do with how environments fractured in the past. So typically we see this oblique line between East and Southern Africa versus Northern and Western Africa again and again and again. So we have to ask ourselves, should we expect humans to have been different? And so what we're left with is this, I've sort of tried to make a more intuitive cartoon rather than a complex diagram here, but we should reject these sort of simple out of Africa models in favor of demographic models of dynamic connections and disconnection between geographically structured populations, really as a consequence of climate change. So, different parts of Africa become habitable as others become uninhabitable, and you have isolation and push-pull factors that bring populations into contact with one another. And there are many implications for this new model that are obviously very relevant to the talk I want to give today. Of course, we need to refine this model. So the questions we need to ask are, did people live across most of Africa or major parts of it? Were they confined to areas of grassland and savanna, or did other ecosystems form barriers? And for example, if we think about what we now know about South Asia, for example, we can ask, when do we see a major expansion of the human niche? Are all sequences in Africa's regions broadly comparable? And did humans share their habitats with other hominins? Do we have a situation such as we see in Eurasia, where we have what are commonly referred to as archaic hominins, more divergent hominin groups, living in different parts of Africa and coming into contact with Homo sapiens? And I think this illustrates the major implication of this model. If we are to consider the whole of the African continent to get to understand human origins in a more realistic framework, then we're not doing very well at the moment. So Africa is obviously very big, as you're all aware. All these different continents fit inside it. It's also a very diverse place. So these are sort of significantly different ecological zones. But if we superimpose fossil sites relevant to the discussion, so fossils from about 300 to 100,000 years ago, we can see that they don't cover most of these different ecological zones, and we don't even have an even spread across Africa. They mostly tend to be bunched in areas where research where you have the most research investment. And if you do a sort of a quick and dirty calculation here, we have something like coverage from about 10% of Africa. So if we want to frame this differently, we could say that we're actually extrapolating for 90% of the continent at the moment with these models of human evolution. And I've never been that confident. If we add archaeological sites, we have better coverage, but obviously archaeology and fossils are telling us different stories. But we still have these huge gaps in Western and Central Africa. And this is a key point to make, because these are the regions of rainforest. So we already know that rainforests had to have played some role in human evolution at different points in time. So for example, at the beginning of the lineage, there are sort of various hominids and very early hominins that had adaptations for like climbing trees, for example. And also there's an isolated molar from a site called Ishango in Central Africa that's about 2 million years old. And it looked that this individual was living in some kind of ecotonal environment, a woodland ecotone adjacent to dense lowland forests. So that there have been sort of these suggestions. And what has been really interesting has been the work that's been going on in South Asia that suggests that, you know, Homo erectus was already encountering rainforests, and there is really solid evidence now that Homo sapiens were in rainforests around 70,000 years ago in South Asia. So the question is, why are we not doing this research in Africa? Why are we not pursuing these questions? You know, and how could we do things better? So to try to answer these questions, we've been zooming in one of these gaps in the map, and that's West Africa. Central Africa is also a really, really key region, but this is where my research is focused, so this is what I'll be talking about today. And like all the gaps on the map, it's obviously very poorly documented, although we're trying to change that. And it's also really interesting because it's a really remote region. So what do I mean by remote? So it's the furthest west of the old world. So a lot of people don't know this. It's actually like the most westerly point is over here in Dakar. And it's also got this really self-contained fluvial network. So if you look at fluvial networks on, for example, the eastern half, central part of Africa, we actually have really good connections. So although these look isolated, there's actually a lot of linkages through tributary systems, and you have the Great Lakes in this area. So there's a great degree of connection in the eastern half of Africa that we just don't see in the West. And of course, this is also a biodiversity hotspot for this reason. It's also isolated because during periods of rainforest fragmentation, West Africa gets cut off from the Central Africa rainforest. So the monsoon is really at the limit of rainforest viability. So if you have a small change in rainfall, then you start to have fragmentation of the rainforest right about here, the Dahomey Gap. So the Central African forests become cut off from the West African forest. So you don't just have these very separate fluvial networks, you also have these sort of mechanisms that fragment the ecosystems as well. And a really important point to make that you know was made in a paper by actually Yadvinder and colleagues is that we really need to move away from this forest-savanna dichotomy. This is something that has been hugely dominant in paleoanthropology, but it's really just not the case. What we're looking at is a mosaic situation where ecotones form their own distinctive community. So what we're looking at is this varied and dynamic environment that are themselves heterogeneous within and across different African regions. So what do I mean? If we look at it this way, you can see this real interdigitation between forest and savanna. So these are very different ecozones, but they're really interdigitated, and you can sort of move between them relatively easily. And the ecotonal areas between them, so these are sort of boundary zones, are not simply just boundary zones, they actually form their own distinct tree communities as well. So what was the role of these forested regions, if we know this, in Africa's deep human past, and what should we expect building on this? So what we know is that there's a rich Stone Age record in West Africa. So various colleagues have actually been reporting this for many decades. It just hasn't really been seen as, it's been seen as like almost like a parochial endeavor looking at this. It's not really being the center of research at all. And a really striking aspect about this record is that there does not seem to be a huge amount of variation by region. What we see is a sort of pretty classic Middle Stone Age record, where there's perhaps an expectation that we would expect to see more specialist tools if people were really sort of adapting in a very strict way to forests in West Africa. And this is an argument that has been made for Central Africa with stone tool cultures like the so-called Lupemben and Sengoan, etc. But if we have this forest savanna mosaic, you know, a major question is whether we should expect significant differences at all in the material culture of people living in these West African patchworks. So we're trying to answer these questions through a major fieldwork program, which is essentially a transect across different West African regions. So we're working in 5 West African countries, and we're sort of trying to really make sure that we're looking at very diverse regions. So we've got low-lying regions like Senegal, we've got highland regions, we've got regions of rainforest, we've got regions sort of at the edge of the Sahel, and we've also got sort of Ghanaian savanna regions of like other types of forests. Sorry. And we're particularly focused on Middle Stone Age archaeology, or Middle Stone or MSA archaeology, which I tend to refer to. And this is the material culture that's associated with the earliest prehistory of our species. So it appears sometime before 300,000 years ago in association with the earliest fossils of our species. And it starts to disappear across Africa broadly around 30,000 years ago. You don't tend to find it anymore. It's replaced by something else called the Later Stone Age, or LSA. And so we wanted to understand that the MSA, because it's really a proxy for human behavior and culture, and so the earliest and longest phase of our species prehistory. Whoops, sorry. Whoops. Okay, so one of the first questions we wanted to ask was to sort of try to roughly quantify archaeological richness in West Africa. So the hypothesis there that is if West Africa did not play a prominent role in human evolution, then we wouldn't expect to find much in this area at all. So to answer this question, we decided to look at Senegal. And this is because Senegal is a small area with very densely packed ecological zones. And so it's really ideal for sampling. And in the first 2-week survey that we conducted, we discovered an incredible number of sites. I think by now we've like tripled or quadrupled the number of Middle Stone Age sites in this small area. And so what this really tells us is that, you know, that there were people here, there were lots of people here. It was an important region in prehistory. And importantly, these sites span the length of the country and its different ecological zones. So it's not just in one region. I mean, of course, we don't know exactly the past association of this site, but certainly they span the modern ecological zones. And these Middle Stone Age technological characteristics can be described as very classic. So you have the typical appearance of something called a Valois technology, which is prepared core technology. This is when knappers take a block of raw material and they shape it to create these convexities in such a way as to strike off a flake of, broadly speaking, a predetermined shape and size. So it's pretty clever stuff. We also see a concern with hafting. So this is mounting your stone tip to a wooden shaft using bindings or resin glues. We see this in shouldered or weakly tanged tools. We have examples of basal thinning of the tool over here, where you sort of thin out the bottom edge of the tool to insert it into some kind of socket haft. Finely made points and denticulates, and also we have some heavy duty elements such as core axes. But what we see here is not particularly distinctive for the MSA. It's pretty generic stuff. But the surprises that we found were not just that we find this stuff pretty ubiquitously everywhere, but the ages of it as well. So as I mentioned, the Middle Stone Age starts to tail off around 40 to 30,000 years ago. And really, it's rare to find anything that's about 25,000 years old, because by then we have this complete replacement by the Later Stone Age, which is this very different miniaturized toolkit that reflects a really different economic base to the MSA. So the MSA disappears across, you know, most of Africa by around 30,000 years ago. And what we find in West Africa is that the MSA continues far longer. So we got some initial dates from one of our sites in the north that dated to 11.7 thousand years ago, which is almost the beginning of the current Holocene epoch, which we thought was pretty shocking. So this is, you know, on average about 20,000 years younger than it is in other regions of Africa. Of course, we didn't quite believe our own results, so we went to have a look for more sites, which we recently published. So we actually have a suite of other young Middle Stone Age dates from other sites in the region, both in the forested south of the country and the arid north, and also in the major river basin, so in the Gambia Basin and the Senegal Basin as well. And, you know, incredibly, the youngest of these was 11,000 years ago. So this really places the Middle Stone Age in the Holocene. So for some reason, in this region of Africa, the Middle Stone Age just lasts for an incredibly long time and seems remarkably stable. And if we piece together our work with those of other colleagues working in West Africa, we can see that we've really got an arc of dates that argues for this continuity of this tradition, rather than, you know, some sort of really strange scenario like the whole thing was reinvented for whatever reason. I mean, I can't imagine what would do that, but let's just say for the sake of argument, we show that this is not the case. And what's really interesting is that at the same time, we have this really correspondingly young Later Stone Age coming in. So the Later Stone Age, the oldest dates are about 70,000 in Eastern Africa, By about 40,000, it really starts to spread. 30,000, you find it in most of Africa. But it's really young in West Africa as well. So it's about 33,000 in the western part of Central Africa, and Cameroon at a site called Shumlaka. And Cameroon is a sort of the gateway to West Africa, but not West Africa proper. But then when we're actually in West Africa in the eastern part, we see the arrival of the LSA between 16 and 12,000 years ago, and it reaches the furthest westerly regions between 15 and 10,000 years ago. So we have this correspondingly late arrival of the LSA, which, you know, maybe adds to this idea that there was no push to change. And it happens during this period of forest expansion. Obviously, it's very difficult to link the two, but it just seems to be happening at a time when forests are also expanding. So here's another paper on the LSA if you want to follow that up. And, you know, the question is why? You know, why does the MSA last so long in West Africa, and why is it so stable? So this is a bit of a mystery, but, you know, we do think we have some answers. So it does seem that parts of West Africa were quite stable during glacial and interglacial cycles, and we know this from looking at the rivers. So there's the river geomorphology shows a certain degree of stability, and we hope to be able to publish soon. Unfortunately, I don't have a paper to show you on that yet. But we did recently publish a paper showing that Paleo-Enso, the El Nino Southern Oscillation influence in sub-Saharan Africa was probably stronger than glacial interglacial cycles even. And what we found was that we see this climatic seesaw going on between Western and Eastern Africa, such that when one is wet, the other is dry. And we think this sort of rainfall dipole really drove an expansion of more ecotonal environments, so to increase this sort of patchwork effect. And ecotonal environments have in numerous studies been linked to sort of like really ideal stable habitats for hominins. So it could be that, you know, that these particular conditions just created sort of quite stable environments that may have allowed people to continue their traditions because there was no particular reason to change what worked well. There's not a lot we can say about human biology during this time, but there is an interesting parallel story emerging. So we have almost no human fossils from West Africa from the Pleistocene, except this one from the site of Iho Eleru in southern Nigeria. So this is again coming from like a rainforest region. And this is the only known fossil from West Africa, and the site contains the only known fossil fauna from West Africa, which we've been looking at. And this individual is really interesting because it's only something between 16 and 12,000 years old, but it looks like an individual that's 100,000 years old plus. So this individual has a really elongated brain case that makes it look like somebody living you know, like an earlier Pleistocene Homo sapiens rather than somebody living almost at the Holocene boundary. And, you know, there've been many questions raised about this fossil. You know, why does it look like this? Is there some archaic admixture going on, or is it sort of isolation? Regardless of what the case is, it is associated probably with later Stone Age technology. So this also raises questions as to how the LSA spread with these forests. You know, is it demic dispersal, or do we have these long isolated populations in West Africa that start to pick up the sort of cultural diffusion? So you know, this site really has the potential to shed some light. We've got this sort of biological and cultural sort of anachronism almost going on in West Africa right up until the Holocene, and these are sort of completely independent lines of evidence. So we're currently analyzing some samples from the fossil, as well as reinvestigating the site itself. And one of the major questions we wanted to answer is, you know, to use a simple dichotomy again, is this individual primarily reliant on rainforest resources or grassland savanna resources? And perhaps we should expect a mixture of the two, given what we know, and our preliminary results seem to be suggesting that that is indeed the case. So how far back does the Middle Stone Age go, and actually, you know, how far can we take it back in sort of really regions of deep rainforest? So we've been looking at the site of Anyama in the Ivory Coast. It's about 60 kilometers from the coast. And this is supposed to be, by numerous metrics, in a region of continual rainforest. So it's a rainforest refugium. And that's calculated generally by looking at various plants, not just the animals. And so, you know, this should be a site that has continually been rainforest. Of course, we have to determine that yet. And it's a really exceptional site because it's incredibly deep. There's 28 meters of sediment with 5 Pleistocene artifact horizons in a rainforest refugium. And it starts with what has been described as a sangoan, which is really large cutting tools, and ends through the sequence to the pottery Neolithic. And it was excavated in the 1980s by a joint Russian Ivorian team, but there were no reliable dates. And I think the reason this site has really been overlooked is because it was all published in Russian, which meant it wasn't exactly accessible to an international audience. And you know, I certainly didn't know about it for the longest time. We did recover samples from MSA levels for analysis. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we had to truncate our field season, but I'll still sort of share some of our preliminary results with you. This is what the material looks like. So in the inset here, you've got a very classic Middle Stone Age on Levallois, and you've got these older, this overlies these older large cutting tool industries, which look fairly crude. So we got a suite of preliminary dates. This is a sequence. So you start having the archaeology around here, all the way to the top. The Middle Stone Age is here, and you have this sort of long sequence of large cutting tools going down. And this is what the site looked like when it was excavated, and this is what it looks like now. We got a suite of OSL dates that are giving us some preliminary indications. I'm not going to go into all of them, but what's really exciting is at the top of Unit C, so where we have the last of the Middle Stone Age, we have a very young date again of 13,000 years ago, which seems to suggest that we also have a young Middle Stone Age in these rainforest regions. And at the top of the lowest unit we sampled, which is at the top of Unit D, so this is where we have the large cutting tools, we're taking things back to a Middle Pleistocene date. And we're hoping to go back to the site soon to get more samples and also conduct some ESR work and some radiocarbon work on the later samples to try to get a really robust chronostratigraphic record from this really important site. And of course, what we're also doing is some leaf wax work on this site to try and determine whether we are genuinely looking at rainforest or not. And unfortunately, phytoliths haven't worked, and there isn't much pollen either. But we hope to be able to answer this question in this way. But I don't have any results there yet, sorry, to share with you. But our working hypothesis is that this is a rainforest, so we need to sort of prove that that isn't the case. This is what the site looks like now. It's a really beautiful area, but it's at risk of development. And here's the old step trench, and this is our sort of clean sections where we took our OSL samples for analysis. And we're also really lucky that we managed to get ancient DNA from a later Stone Age individual from the broader region, not from this site. We do have endogenous DNA from the sample, so hopefully we'll be able to soon shed some light on population history of this region to accompany what we're doing with the material culture as well. So we've talked about the sort of more open environments in West Africa, we've contrasted them with the rainforests, but there's also a lot of area in between, and this is where we come to Benin. So with Benin, we're working in the Pendjari National Park, which is in northwestern Benin, and it's this amazingly diverse landscape. So you've got gallery forests around the Pendjari River, and you've got Sudanian and northern Guinean savannas mixed with areas of grassland. So again, you have this real interdigitation of different ecological zones. And it's a really unique site. Unfortunately, we don't have dates yet, so waiting for the dates. It's got abundant archaeology, and it's not a karstic region. This is the only cave. It's caused by faulting, so it's a bit of freak formation of this cave. And there's, you know, it's absolutely beautiful. And there's the material culture is made on some exotic raw materials such as jasper, which was brought in from about 60 kilometers away. So, you know, these people seem to be highly mobile as well. And this is what the site looks like. Sorry, there's no sound. It's just the sound of a waterfall, just to give you some kind of appreciation of, you know, it's a lovely place with this punch bowl, and you've got this you know, this cave, which is or the mouth of the mountain, which is very romantic in the local language. Oops, sorry. And this is, this is what it looks like. This is just before we put our test trenches in. And we were really amazed by what we found, because, these are all stone tools. So like piles and piles and piles of stone tools on top of each other. It's an incredibly rich site. And, the material is absolutely stunning. Like some of the most beautiful examples of Middle Stone Age technology, I think, that I've had the fortune to see. And it's not just at this site. We have very similar raw material from surface sites nearby, so open air sites. We picked up some material from the surface, but we also found subsurface material, so we were able to get chronological samples from that as well. So, hopefully we'll have some idea of how old this is as well. And I think it's really anyone's guess, knowing that it could be very young or it could be extremely old, since, we have quite a long record. So just some preliminary conclusions, because there's still so much work to be done. There's so many results that we're still expecting, so this all has to be rather tentative. But it looks pretty certain that we're looking at a really ancient hominin presence. We don't know if it's all Homo sapiens at this point. I think it's safe to say that at least some of it is. What's really interesting is that we have like relatively homogeneous Middle Stone Age that seems to be present in all ecoregions. Some of our colleagues working in Central Africa have sort of argued that some of the stone tool assemblages that have sort of these really big cutting tools are something specific about living in the forest. There have been reports of similar industries in West Africa, but we just don't know how old they are. They could be very young, because we know that there was sort of a late macrolithic in the Holocene where people were making these very coarse looking axes. So, what we know from our dated material is that everything looks very, very homogeneous, well made, persists for a long time, and is very stable. We know that this is the case across different ecological zones. So we have this young MSA deep in the rainforest probably, and also sort of at the edges of the Sahel. The latest Stone Age arrives quite late in West Africa, and it seems to spread with forests. But we really don't know if this is cultural diffusion, or whether it's populations moving through the landscape with these changes. There is a change of behavior, but this degree of cultural versus biological changeover is an open question. We hope we can address that to some degree when we finish analyzing the ancient DNA that we have. What's really interesting to me is that there's definitely some period of coexistence between the MSA and the LSA. So really we have people embedded in radically different cultural traditions sharing a landscape for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Really, West Africa seems to have a very distinct regional sequence. It's not like what we see in East Africa or Southern Africa or even Northern Africa. It seems to be this reservoir of stability and possible continuity. And I think what we can say about rainforests and human evolution is that rainforests, at least in this part of Africa, don't seem to have been barriers. But people seem to have been able to navigate within this sort of mosaic environment with a flexible and reliable stone tool technology that really lasted for a phenomenally long period of time in this part of Africa. And I think, to me, this suggests that we're looking at West Africa as a cultural and biological reservoir that played a key role in the success of our species. So having eras of long-term population continuity is obviously really important. And is this really the context or the cradle of ecological modernity, where humans at some point in their prehistory really seem to be comfortable moving between very, very diverse ecological zones. And this is obviously a skill that helped humanity to adapt to like living in every corner of the earth imaginable. And a major question to me is this cradle of ecological modernity in these rainforest savanna mosaics, and is it something about this patchwork that's important for understanding this process in human evolution? So thank you very much for listening. I just want to thank my team as well, who are obviously doing a lot of this research as well. And yeah, some acknowledgements to my colleagues as well, especially my colleagues in West Africa. We're working with a lot of different colleagues there, both individually, locally, and also some colleagues working together across the entire region. And I just want to recommend some like further reading here in case you're interested in following up some of the things that I've been saying. So I think I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. Let me just stop your sharing. Okay, now again, for questions, I'd encourage you to switch on your cameras if you like. It's nice to have an audience in there as well. And we can open up to questions. While we're waiting for some questions, you can either just raise your hand or stick a question in chat, or if there's any reason why you're unable to directly ask your question, just let me know and I can relay it. But while we're waiting, I'd just like to clarify where we are in terms of the earliest ages that you're finding in West Africa. The second half of your talk focused on this late Middle Stone Age to late Stone Age transition. And are you finding evidence of earlier archaeological remains there? And if not, why not?
Yeah, we definitely have Middle Pleistocene archaeological remains. You know, we're probably looking at, for sure, something between 200 and 150,000 years, which is really pushing it to sort of like some of the earlier phases of human evolution. And, you know, I'm sure it's going to keep going back. There's also, you know, the culture from that preceded the Middle Stone Age, which is the earlier Stone Age, with the Acheulean hand axes at certain sites. I think only one of the dates has been published from that. I'm not sure if it has been published yet, but you know, some of them also seem to be quite young. So it could be that, you know, turnovers are quite late in West Africa, but certainly the record is old and it persists for a really long time, and we're just trying to find out why.
Okay, great. Okay, Gopesh, you have a question?
First of all, thanks, Ali, for such a wonderful presentation. Just down my hand. It's, back in the papers, also in your cell, what you published, you always talk about the ecological backwaters or closing and opening of these areas. My question is about, sorry for that. My question is about, in the archaeological sequences or the materials, do you see any kind of a localization or regionalization of the technology, and then some generic elements coming in the picture when the area must be open to the other populations to come? So do you see such behavioral trends in the material culture over there?
I mean, a little bit, but not really. I mean, you know, I'm somebody who sort of cut their teeth working in the North African Middle Stone Age, which has this, you know, very distinctive regional tradition, almost freakishly distinctive regional tradition. And I think to a certain extent, you might expect to see a similar sequence in all the different African regions, and, you know, expect to see this like development of these sort of unique cultural trajectories. And, you know, that there are some aspects of the West African record that seem relatively individual. So there are, for example, some examples of foliates that look, you know, they don't look like, for example, foliates from Central Africa or Northern Africa. They, you know, it's quite a generic term, but the shape of them is quite different. They're sort of quite small and squarish. There's a question mark over the large cutting tools, but I mean, I think that the takeaway feature is actually it's incredibly generic in a nice way. Like the tools are very well made, they're very beautiful, the raw material is very nice, but they are like pretty generic from what we can tell so far.
Just one point I wanted to ask. In the between, you have talked about this weakly tagging or kind of poorly shouldering of the artifacts. Can you put more light on that? Like, do we see any diagnostic tagging among the artifacts, like any very clear evidence of hafting?
No, there's nothing like the Aterian, if that's what you mean. Like, it doesn't seem to cross the Senegal River, so we know that there are Aterian tang tool in Mauritania, but we thought we might find some in Senegal, in the northern parts of Senegal, but we didn't. We just had these sort of very generic, you know, weakly shouldered pieces and basally thinned pieces that, you know, show that people were hafting. But, you know, we don't see this sort of strong reliance on, for example, a single method like tanging.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you have a comment in chat. Would you like to ask that directly, or else I can relay it? Not hearing anything, so I'll just relay it. Are you finding some bone sites, some sites with reasonable bone preservation, formal at least?
Yeah, so, Iho Elaru, obviously we know there's good preservation. We have a faunal assemblage from there, which we hope to publish soon. And we eventually should go back to like re-excavate the sites. There are areas that haven't been excavated, and there's also like other rock shelters in the area that should have good bone preservation. The cave, Tanongu Cave in Benin also seems to have good, or at least has a high chance of good bone preservation. We think we did have some really friable bone on sort of subsurface. So, you know, the conditions are right for good bone preservation. So we're hoping that when we go back there and excavate more than just a test trench, that we'll find some bone there as well.
Okay. Any more questions? I'll pitch in another one then. So the evidence you're presenting for the Middle Stone Age in West Africa seems to suggest a surprising degree of isolation and stability. That the Middle Stone Age is well advanced in East Africa and other places, and yet you've got the Late Stone Age, you've got this Middle Stone Age cultures persisting in West Africa for a long time. And how does that square with this idea of different cultures contributing to developing this? What's the evidence that there is this contribution pooling together towards a common human origin, rather than West Africa being some outlying region where a culture developed that was rather isolated and didn't contribute to the greater African pool of culture?
Yeah, I mean, with a caveat that we have to be careful, because we don't have too many sites yet, and you know, West Africa cannot compare with the sort of decades and decades of detailed work that you have in like East Africa and also now in Southern Africa. But I think, you know, I think there's a tendency in archaeology to want to look for, you know, what's different. We want to find, you know, the really fancy parts of the archaeological record. When do they have personal ornamentation? When are they using bone tools? But, you know, these things appear and disappear in different parts of Africa for the whole of the Middle Stone Age. Stuff just has to keep being reinvented because local populations go extinct, or they forget how to do these things. Some demographic patterns going on there. So I think actually, you know, maybe the less interesting part of the material culture record might be more important than we've been giving credit. So even some parts of Eastern Africa, we do have these very long, generic Middle Stone Age records that no one has been interested in looking at, because they just don't look as interesting as, for example, tang tools, or these sort of beautiful foliate points. So, you know, these are really striking elements of the archaeological record. But for example, you know, those very generic stone tool industries are now associated with people actively using fire to like control their landscapes and modify their landscapes. So I think, you know, we really need to move away from this idea that the only interesting behavior is something that's actually visible in the archaeological record. How, you know, how people are engaging with their ecologies, I think, you know, with these questions that you can only answer through paleoecological work, I think are going to be really, really interesting, and are going to really shed light on why we don't see these maybe major differences in the material culture record in the way we do in other parts of Africa.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Jesus.
Yes. Hi, Eleanor. Thank you very much for the presentation. So I'm curious. I'm not at all into this, so it's super interesting to me to learn a bit more. To what extent can you tell us something about what these tools have been used for, like if it was for hunting, for instance?
Yeah.
And to what extent have you found some remains as well from these possible animals that they have been hunting? And the second question is more about to what extent in the different sites that you have visited, can you tell something about kind of revisits of these regions or of these sites by different communities through time? So communities are in a given place, and then they leave, but probably new communities into the same regions. What is this time lag that you have in there?
Yeah, so the resolution we have is not sufficient to kind of say, well, you know, there was a population that lived somewhere for a short amount of time. I mean, probably, you know, these sites are all palimpsest. People are coming back over and over again to the same areas and laying down their tools. So the resolution is somewhat coarse. So you know, there is a question of how we fit those dynamics to the environmental dynamics as well. But that said, we can capture at least some idea of how people were using these landscapes. So the stone tools, these kind of quite generic stone tools. There are points which are probably used for hunting. There are generic steeply retouched pieces that were probably used for scraping hides. These seem to be the case everywhere. There's a lot of hide scraping or woodwork. And the sort of really heavy duty sort of axe type tools are generally thought to have been used for heavy duty woodwork or cutting down trees or even digging for tubers, or some kind of like digging tools. And they're also attaching these stone tools to wooden shafts. So they're hafting the tools as well, which means that they probably have some kind of spears as well. The animals that they're hunting, there's very preliminary work, since we only have one zooarchaeological assemblage from West Africa at the moment, and it's not published yet, but they are hunting a mixture of savanna and rainforest animals. The savanna animals also live in the rainforest, so it's very difficult to tell where they're getting them, but the rainforest animals only live in the rainforest. So this is actually sort of maybe telling us something about how they exploited these landscapes, but at the moment, it's very difficult to say more.
What sort of rainforest animals are coming up?
Sorry.
What sorts of rainforest animals?
Just so I think there's some types of rabbits and deer, types of antelopes. I don't know the exact sort of species at this point, but it's something that my postdoc Emily Hamill is working on. So hopefully we'll be able to send that to publication soon. She's finished her analysis.
And in terms of rainforest plants, what are you seeing? Are you seeing tubers? Are you seeing other?
Not yet. So unfortunately, we haven't managed to get hold of a lot of phytoliths or pollen. Just hasn't seemed to be like very good preservation at the sites that we have at the moment, but we'll see as we look on whether we'll be able to get some more better samples.
Okay.
Thank you, Eleanor.
Savannah, would you like to answer?
Yeah, thank you. I came across a research some time ago in Oxford that the ideal size of a settlement, a human settlement or a hominin settlement, and this time period we're talking about, consists of something like 148.7. So it was come to approximately about 150. Have you been able to calculate or determine a size of an ideal settlement in this time period?
Yeah, so I think perhaps what you're referring to are these ideas of networks. So there have been some calculations on like network size based on neocortex size, and this is work that has been driven at Oxford by Robin Dunbar. And so these are these estimates of how big like a person's greater network could be. But that's sort of distinguished from how big a given group size is. So generally a given group size is calculated on the carrying capacity of the environment that they live in. So if you live, for example, in quite an arid environment where resources are quite spread out, then you'll probably be like quite a small group and you have to cover a lot of ground. Whereas if you're living somewhere that is quite abundant, then you probably have a larger group size and you don't need to be as spread out. So there's been a lot of studies looking at group size from this perspective. So it's very much sort of a carrying capacity ecology-based perspective. When it comes to rainforests, generally there's been this idea that rivers were not important because they're very wet environments. However, work that's been carried out in the Amazon, for example, looking at archaeology in the Amazon, has tended to show that rivers were very important areas for human settlement. So we expect to see something similar as well in West Africa. And indeed, our major stratified site, Anyama, is on a small river.
Thank you. Okay, Gopesh, did you have another question?
Yeah, just a curiosity about like the preceding core tool assemblages. What kind of relationship you see in the MP assemblages and these core tool assemblages? I don't know whether they fall into traditional Acheulean assemblages or not. Do you see any kind of convergence, emergence of the MP industries in those parts of the West Africa? Or it seems that it's coming from somewhere else.
Yeah, I think it's difficult to say at this point because we don't know how old the record is. If we're looking at an early middle Pleistocene for the Middle Stone Age, then it's kind of matching the sort of Pan-African idea. The Acheulean is a separate question. It's a different species. It could be a similar scenario, but it could be different as well. It's very difficult to tell. Yeah, we just don't have enough data really to be able to answer those sorts of questions.
But do you see any kind of a diminutization of those core tools when you're are you encountering those core tools in the MP?
A kind of what, sorry?
Like the diminutive pieces.
Oh, you mean when the LSA comes, the size of the, okay, not with the Middle Stone Age. The size of Middle Stone Age tools is strongly linked to the package size of the raw material. So if you have a small package size, you get small tools. But everywhere you have like a larger package size, you get larger stone tools as well. Whereas, you know, with the LSA miniaturization, there's no relationship with package size. They're deliberately making things small, and they're using techniques like bipolar percussion, hammer and anvil, because they're using, you know, they're making very small tools. So you have to use a kind of technique. These techniques are entirely absent in the late MSA of West Africa. So we don't have a comparable scenario like, for example, in Eastern Africa, where you have, for example, I don't know, the Levallois turns up in like the Neolithic, and you have sort of this real mixture of MSA and LSA elements happening. This is not something we see in West Africa so far.
Any more questions? Okay, I'll round off with a final question then. This is it's a wonderful topic. It's wonderfully interdisciplinary in the perspectives that come across there. And I was wondering, some of the audience, including myself, are ecologists, and what would you like to see coming from ecologists from ecology? What are the insights and the questions you have that ecology can help contribute to an answer?
Yeah, I think it would be really, really interesting to have some parallel studies using you know, Pan-African mammal species, generalist species like humans, to try to understand how they're utilizing these mosaic patches of very different ecologies. I think there's this understanding that, you know, if you have a rainforest patch, then you have these super specialized animals living there, and you know, it's not a place for like generalist species, but that's, you know, that's not true. And I think, you know, how they navigate this sort of really interesting mosaic environment, this interdigitation of different ecological zones would be really instructive for us in paleoanthropology to try to understand how, you know, humans may also have been using these environments. So this sort of concept of ecological modernity is relatively new in paleoanthropology. You know, when did people start to expand their niche? Why did they expand their niche, and how might they have done so is very much an emerging question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'll see if we can step up to the challenge. But thank you. That was terrific and fascinating. And really,
my pleasure.
But also, I'm really pleased to see West Africa rise in prominence. It's an area that I've worked a number of
yes.
in many aspects of rainforest science or how tropical science is a neglected area, but really.
Yeah, hopefully in a year we'll be able to say a lot more too.
Yeah, so thank you for opening the door a bit on West Africa to the world as well. It's great. Okay. And we have a tradition of this seminar, so those of you new are unmuting our microphones and giving audible applause to our guest speaker. So I'd encourage you to do that, and thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, and the recording will be put on YouTube, so feel free to look at that later and share with your students and colleagues. So thank you, Ellie, and
thank you everyone for coming. Okay, bye-bye. Have a lovely weekend.